All right, everybody, let's do this thing. I am Drew McManus, the author of Adaptistration, and this is my podcast, Shop Talk, where I invite captivating guests to talk about engaging topics connected to the orchestra business. Today's guests, first up, we have David MacDonald. David is an award-winning composer and teacher whose music has been performed around the world and now, thanks to the pandemic, also on the internet. He teaches music theory, composition, and technology at Wichita State University, where he also directs the new music ensemble Happening Now. He is a frequent contributor to Scoring Notes on topics related to contemporary music notation and iPad music tools. Oh, that sounds so cool, and we are going to jump into that later. And he also co-hosts the Scoring Notes podcast. Recent projects include a chamber work for remote, socially distanced performance over Zoom and a game score for the Apple Arcade launch titled Possessions. Hello, David.
Hello, it's good to be here.
And next up, we've got Sam Merciers. I got your last name correct, didn't I, Sam?
Yes.
All right. Sam is a lecturer and coordinator of music theory and composition at the University of North Alabama, where he is a co-founder and director of the contemporary ensemble UNACE. He is an active composer, performer, and intermedia artist with a diverse artistic background. In addition to concert works, Sam's work focuses on music with film, collaborative efforts in sound design for theater and documentary film, and in interactive sound installations. Hello, Sam.
Thanks for having us, Drew. Good to see you again.
Good to see you guys, too. And before I forget, what exactly constitutes intermedia artist, Sam?
When you like to do stuff with your hands, and you're going to basically when you're including into your art things that you're only sort of good at, but you forgive yourself for your mediocrity and just include them into your project anyway. So multimedia artist tends to suggest, I think, that it's sort of like lives and is created in the computer. Intermedia sort of could be that, but also opens it up to like physical things that are built or modified, spaces that are treated in a certain way, this kind of thing. So basically not that much different, just wanting to be a little more inclusive.
I have a feeling that's going to be a Wikipedia entry soon. But it also kind of touches on one of my pet peeves about just bios in general and the way that people talk in this business, which is there are a lot of terms, especially now, that are being generated that aren't inaccurate, that is not as though they aren't applicable, but they are clearly something new that when you look at it, you think, huh. And, I think we're going to jump into that maybe a little bit ahead, but let me first give those listening and watching this a little bit broader perspective for who you two guys are, really. I mean, you're both composers, and you're both in academia with full-time tenured teaching positions, correct?
I'm not tenured.
Oh.
I am tenure track.
Tenure track. Well, I just opened my mouth and insert foot, didn't I?
That's all right.
I'm tenured in the sense that if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, the department would be in very, very, very bad shape. So that's how I'm tenured.
You are a key adjunct.
No, I'm not adjunct. I'm full-time, but I'm not tenure track.
Ah, so many terms.
It's weird. It's like the military, but deliberately confusing. The military ranks are confusing on accident. Academic rank is confusing on purpose.
On purpose.
Yes, I 100% agree.
Man, that launches us, I think, right into what we want to talk about, which is really composers in academia, because this is kind of the cycle that the business works. And this is another one of my pet peeves is the gulf that exists between academia and the nonprofit performing arts sector. So orchestras, operas, and all the other groups thrown in together. There's always been this bit of a gulf, but they obviously are interconnected. One doesn't exist without the other, and what one does impacts the other. And it's always been bizarre to me to see how far apart those two sectors are when they really are so dependent upon one another. Even if it's at best in more of a dynamic sense, they are still codependent on one another. So we're going to be talking about things that are, yes, composer-oriented, but also academic-oriented, and how the art lives in between all of that. And so I'm going to jump in with kind of my first question, which is going to be to both of you, which is the challenge of preparing students in this reality. I mean, let's even just take the pandemic out of it, which is a big enough issue. But the reality of where classical music is in this day and age, does it feel like you're an instructor at a kamikaze flight school or what?
I mean, I definitely can relate to that. And I think to some extent, composers are just kind of further out on that limb than a lot of the other specializations within music, right? It's only slightly more tenuous than, getting a viola performance degree or something. And I think one of the things that I talk to my students about all the time is that that what we're doing it sometimes has some elements of job training to it, but it's not the same as job training. And that I hope that they are learning how to be a better composer, but that's our main goal. And that what they do with music when they're out of school is, I don't know, informed by what they do when they're in school, but I don't know what those things are going to be. The jobs that they are going to have, the careers that they are going to have, basically don't exist yet. And I can teach them and tell them about my career path, but it's unlikely that their career path is going to be the same. And I try to give them a broad set of skills, but I don't know what I can do to prepare them for a career, because it's not like a career, even more than performance, where you can just go and get a job somewhere and like have that be your job. You have to be a pretty high level performer to have that kind of gig normally, but that kind of doesn't exist for composers outside of academia. Sam, I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that Dave has undergraduates and graduate students that are majors. University of North Alabama is mainly a music education school. Well, no, I wouldn't even say that anymore. Recently, the vocal programs, both choir and really opera, have been growing a lot. Very strong departments. But we graduate a lot of band directors. We don't have a composition degree. I've had what I would consider some composition majors, which means they get a music degree of some kind, and all of their electives are in music composition lessons, basically. And I have a student now, I just got finished, I wouldn't say writing 6, dispersing 6 slightly modified recommendation letters to 6 places, and he's going to be starting his DMA in composition. So I would consider him a composition major. But in contrast to Dave, I think Dave and I have discussed this before, where he kind of envies the way I get to be, and I envy the way he gets to be with his students. I have many students who just take composition because they need an elective. And because we don't have a major, I will teach, like some students, I will have 1 semester of composition lessons, and I force them to complete a piece and see it performed, and then they're gone and I don't see them anymore. Some of them take for several semesters and could be composition majors if they wanted to, but I'm not under any obligation to sort of give them, unless they're sort of this unofficial composition major, I'm not under any obligation to make sure they know how to write for string quartet, or make sure that they, whatever you're supposed to make sure undergraduate composers can do. So my experience,
if you figure that out, let me know.
Yeah. So my experience is quite a bit different than Dave. I think oftentimes I'm giving them the ability to think more creatively and have a lot more musical agency, because if you can actually compose something, put the dots and the lines down, and then hear people play it back at you, that is an experience that any band director, for example, I can't imagine it would be bad for that person.
Interesting. Those are two both excellent perspectives. And as you were both talking, it made me kind of realize there's some stuff we're taking for granted probably for a lot of listeners, which composers, compared to something like an instrumentalist. If you're an instrumentalist, you study to become a viola major, you get a job, you have a relatively delineated career path. I mean, the vast majority look to get a job at a professional U.S. orchestra, and then you can earn a salary or a per service annual compensation. But composers don't get that. Orchestras don't have a full-time positioned composers. Even if there's something like a composer in residence, that's not the same thing as being a salaried, tenured, unionized musician. So, that maybe gives a little bit more framework for folks to wrap their head around. So they're two types of students that are going through the same programs ostensibly, but they have two vastly different paths once they graduate for career stability and earning a living. And for composers, it is considerably more precarious than it is. There aren't as many opportunities. It's a much rougher way to try to get into a job. There's a lot more self-promotion that has to go into it, and a bunch of other stuff we're going to be talking about. And that's really what I was getting at with the Kamikaze Flight School, which is difficult.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't know if I would agree that there are necessarily fewer opportunities. There are fewer opportunities that look like music composition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are fewer opportunities to have a career in music that builds on things that you learn in school. But I think maybe a smaller proportion of them look like music composition. And I think a lot of the things that composers have to do in school involve developing skills of working with other people and planning and executing projects that I think can help them in a lot of different kinds of music careers. I think the skills that you can learn through the process of creating a piece from scratch and following it through to a performance can lead you to be a really good private piano teacher. They can lead you to be in different areas of leadership and administration. And I think a lot of in new music, the people that are doing really exciting and interesting and innovative things in leadership and administration are often people that went to school for composition. I'm thinking of somebody like Gavin Chuck at Alarm Will Sound, I think went to school for composition. And I think that's a pretty common place for people in those kinds of positions to come from, in part out of necessity, but I think also in part because the skills of having an idea, making a plan to execute on that idea, and seeing it through are the kinds of, it's very similar to entrepreneurship, I think. And I think that's one of the skills that, in kind of an abstract way, composers develop while they're in school.
Yeah. I was thinking the same sort of thing, Dave. I was thinking for performance majors, there is one possible path that is way more clear. I mean, if you hammer your excerpts like a madman or a mad person, you have a pretty good shot if you really practice hard and you're really good. But there's a lot of people who are really good, but not quite good enough to win that audition, who have exciting and rich musical lives doing all kinds of different things. I don't think you've ever asked the viola performance major, what do you want to do? Well, I want to have this orchestra gig part-time and this orchestra gig part-time, and I want to teach 14 students in this city and another 16 students in this city. And then I want to pick up gigs, here on the weekend. And then I always want to do this thing in the summer, which also pays this much money. That's what a lot of these people end up with in reality. And we all know this.
Yeah, there's not like you can be a percussion tech and move to Dallas and work at two different high schools and have a very comfortable career.
Yes.
There's not like middle school, high school composition teachers. There are some, but there aren't a lot of people that are teaching composition lessons to younger kids the way there are for every instrument and voice. And so I think the sorts of careers are different, and they are less obviously related to, sitting in a quiet room and thinking thoughts about sounds the way we think of composition.
Keep going on that direction, the less obvious direction. In both of your work with your students, how much of that really integrates itself into the educational experience, or is that mutually exclusive from what you work with students on?
I would say it depends on the student. It's very dependent on the circumstances and the context. I can say that certainly my students are always responsible for arranging performances of their works and scheduling those rehearsals and planning for the things that need to go in the program and surround the logistics of the performance. And that's kind of like a very beginning level of these kinds of things. Sometimes, depending on who the students are and what's going on around town, there might be the assignment to have a performance somewhere else, and I leave all of the stuff up to them. I just make sure that they have the support that they need from me and the university, and that's a thing that we've done before as well. I had the composition studio class as a group put together these kinds of structured improvisations to silent films and arrange a performance at the silent film series at a dinner theater here in town. And like that was the thing that they did for the semester. And I like, it's not exactly the sort of thing they might do professionally, but it's also a thing. It was part of a series that involved a lot of other professional musicians, and I think they may have even gotten paid from it. I don't remember. It's been a couple of years, but I mean that's something that we have done in the past. I think there's I don't know, Sam, do you want to jump in here? I can go on beyond that, but
excuse me. I think once again, because of the nature of my job, I have a somewhat different experience than Dave would. Also should note that I see every music major. I teach every section of music theory 1 through 4, and this is changing coming up soon, and every section of sight singing and ear training, which is sort of the lab for the music theory class. So if you're a music major, you see Sam 5 days a week for 2 straight years, during the semester anyway.
You should use that in recruiting.
Get this, 2 straight years.
5 days a week.
That should be on all of the material recruiting for the music department at UNA. It should just be a picture of you pointing to your face.
Sam, all the day.
Yeah. So I would say, like, one of my students, like Jeremy Smith, who is the one, he's finishing up his master's at Middle Tennessee State right now. He was a real composer. Capital C composer is what I would call it. And that's what he wants to be. And so he got treated differently. But I have many students who are the toe dippers, who take 1 or 2 semesters of lessons. And for those people, and there's no prerequisite either, if they want to sign up. So people who might know something, but they might not know how to point at the notes on a piano or anything, I teach that person composition lessons too. So in that case, I'm teaching them how I'll say, okay, we're going to do a piece in compound meter. Why? Because I know all these incoming students can't do compound meter. So compose away, but it's got to be in compound meter. And I've told this to students many times. If you want to know how to do rhythm, have a rhythm in your brain and then try and make Sibelius give you the rhythm you've got in your brain. When you can do that, then you've mastered it, right? So that's one example. The very early stage, it's part of teaching them what music is and how to talk about it and how to label different things, but also trying to get them to use their intuition a lot.
But doesn't that also align very much with the reality that I would have to imagine most individuals who are interested in learning about composition, even outside of academia, are going to find themselves in? There's no real experience. They just kind of get thrown into it. They know it's not what they want to do, but they still have an interest or just like learning.
Yes, absolutely. Something I encounter frequently is that people are afraid that there are some rules that they have to learn about how to do it, and they can't get started until they know what those things are so that they can abide by them. The biggest thing I try to do right out of the gate, and this is for people who want to be capital C composers or otherwise, is get that idea out of their head as quickly as possible.
Well, that gives me a thought, which is kind of moving into one of the next topics, which is a little bit more of where technology overlaps with a lot of this. And Dave, that's certainly certainly with inside your wheelhouse. But Sam, you mentioned the things that people don't know about composing. And I'm going to show my age here just a little bit, that when I was in school, finale didn't even get to the point to where it actually had a year attached to it yet. Mm-hmm. And I distinctly remember the professors wouldn't allow you to turn in assignments that were printed out in finale because it was still not that good yet. And so we had to do everything by hand. But there are so many things now that composition programs, and you've mentioned one, Sibelius. There's really 2, and I'll probably let Dave speak more to this, finale and Sibelius, that are 2 of the big ones. But if I had those tools when I was back in school and learning and composing, and I used to do a lot of arranging, just to be able to help with a lot of the stuff that would be otherwise basic 101 level mistakes, even just transposing, making sure that's correct, and making sure you get the ranges for the level of player, what's difficult, what's not difficult. Simple things like that these programs just provide out of the box and can, tap you on the shoulder and say, you really shouldn't do that.
All of this is related to something that any academically trained composer is going to have a word for, and for me it's finale composing. Like what we're talking about is the idea of finale composing, and it's kind of a hot topic amongst some composition teachers.
Oh, good.
Dave?
Well, I think no, I mean, so when a lot of times when I have first year students come in to university who say that they're interested in composition. Some of them just say that they're interested in composition because it sounds neat, but some of them have been playing around with these kinds of programs for a long time and just kind of exploring. And I think that's one of the things that students get from those kinds of experiences is it's a zero stakes environment, right? If you're in the situation that you were talking about earlier, Drew, and if you're a student and you need to write everything by hand, and the only way that you're going to hear anything resembling what that sounds like is either to learn the oral skills to hear it in your head, or to get 45 people together, copy out all the parts, make all the mistakes, and hear how terrible it sounds, and throw it all out and quit everything. The students who are coming in now have this experience of using something like Finale or Sibelius, or what I use these days is Dorico, or what they are more likely to be coming in with is MuseScore, which is a free open source notation application. That is where their experience is, and they get practice, and they may not be able to identify what sounds off. And I think that's one of the things that they learn from music theory and oral skills studies is to be able to identify the things that are sounding a little bit funky to them and not like the things that they expect to hear. But they do have some experience with just manipulating and feeling some, to use the word that Sam used earlier, agency over those sounds is a really powerful thing. And also, I think in a lot of ways for musicians, it's valuable in kind of demystifying what composers are and what they do, and that like Beethoven wasn't like some kind of angel. He was just a guy that sat in a chair and figured stuff out for a long time. And that's a really powerful realization for young musicians to realize that that genius is not a thing that really exists. It's just a lot of hard work and a lot of luck and a lot of privilege, but it's not something that is inaccessible to them.
Yes, it shortens the feedback loop is the big thing. I'm sorry, Drew.
Oh, no. Go ahead. Actually, David, the direction you were going there actually moves in a direction that I wanted to chat about, and it does in a very good way, which is those digital composing skills, which are definitely something that have to be developed and learned just like any other skill. They do, I think, intersect with the professional orchestra and opera field in particular, far more than what I think people probably realize, even inside the field, realize as far as a profound impact. There's something called Baumol's curse, which is an economic theory that, in a nutshell, says that groups like orchestras and operas never really benefit from the traditional savings that most type of corporate or commercial businesses gain by way of technology. You can't get an automated assembly line to cut your labor cost or to make things more efficient and, lower your overhead and your costs so you can keep the product cost down and you can control things. It's always going to take the same number of musicians to play the same piece of music as it always has been from the time it was written until the time where it gets forgotten. That's not going to change. But that doesn't mean that the field is entirely immune to advances and improvements and efficiencies in technology. And one area that again, showing my age, that I've lived long enough to see an impact in is in the field of music librarians in professional orchestras. And since you guys are at the nexus of that whole technology aspect, and you've seen how composers have to deliver their final product, talk a little bit about that. How have you seen librarians maybe intersect with the field? What do they need to learn? How have you prepared composers for delivering a product to something like a full orchestra?
That's Dave's field.
Well, I'll say I'll caveat this by saying that I work mostly with chamber music and am therefore not dealing with librarians a ton. However, I do because obviously, well, unless I can't imagine unless you're like Kronos Quartet, maybe Kronos Quartet has a librarian. I don't know what groups have librarians in chamber music, but what I would say is librarian is actually, I think, another good example of a career that a person with a background in music composition would be very well prepared for. And I know a lot of librarians who studied composition in college. The thing about being a librarian is that you have to deal with music sources from a lot of different people who are all using different kinds of tools, and those tools are changing very rapidly. And I think the most important thing that we can give our students is an understanding of the basic principles that they can apply, because those tools are going to change. Finale, as much as I love what Make Music has done over the last 30 years, I don't think they're going to be around in 10 years. And the same could be said of other tools. There will be new tools. They will work very differently. And the way we prepare scores and distribute them to players is very different. I direct the new music ensemble at Wichita State. Sam directs the contemporary music ensemble at UNA. And I can't speak for Sam, but I conduct almost exclusively from my iPad. And I have some players who read iPads in the ensemble. And that is going to start changing in orchestras. It's already, I think, taken over a lot of chamber music score prep. And I think it is starting to become more common in larger and larger ensembles for even if it's just one player bringing their own and managing that themselves. But there are better and cheaper tools for managing kind of the fleets of devices that are involved in orchestral and opera performance in particular.
Imagine the principal violinist and the librarian sitting there going through the first violin part and marking it should be up, down, up there, and this should be whatever, and it auto-populates in everybody else's part. So what would take exponentially longer is done.
And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that there are fewer librarians, but it lets those librarians focus on other things that might be more valuable or more musical, or just be different and perhaps less tedious than grabbing 14 copies of the first violin part and making the exact same markings in all 14 of them.
And figuring out how to deal with paper sizes and getting things to print right and have the right margins. Any academic composer has dealt with that particular brand of cat herding a lot.
And that's actually a big... Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, you both touched on what are almost like trigger subjects for me, which I'm even trying to dig this up in the blog. It's so old. I mean, this was back in the aughts that I used to write about the emergence of e-stands, electronic music stands, which you guys are talking about are still...
And those used to be like
there.
enormous devices
huge.
that cost $10,000.
Yes.
Yeah.
Huge. And it's gotten much better. But even the scenario that you're talking about, Sam, where, the concertmaster can just send in all their bowings and do them in real time, and then it's just distributed to everyone. They can make one change in their part and push it back to everyone on the stand in the actual rehearsal. So you don't have to have the musician sit there and go, "What did you say?" And yes, all of those examples, that makes sense. It's another area that's driven me crazy because, in particular, librarians early on used to be very resistant, except for a few very forward-thinking ones. I remember getting into an argument with one who was trying to say, well, what's supposed to happen if the power goes out in the middle of the concert and they can't read their stands anymore? To which the response was, what do they normally do when the power goes out in the middle of a concert? They're probably going to stop playing anyway. I mean, those... But it's this resistance to technology as being a benefit as opposed to not. And the area that I have seen a lot of good progress on this has been in academia. And I think, David, what you were talking about with especially chamber groups small ensemble sizes, even just duos and single performers, are much better positioned to do that because they don't have the larger political structure to work within. But it is academia that really pushed a lot of that with experimentation and developing the technology and doing a lot of things that never went anywhere, but ultimately led to an acceptance of the concept that really became ushered in with the advent of the iPad generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that stuff is much more accessible than it's ever been. It's actually a large part of kind of my beat, such as it is at Scoring Notes, is covering those kinds of iPad-based workflows, mostly for reading music. But there are a few things for writing music. They're not great yet, but there are some really cool tools for dealing with the kinds of librarian things that we were talking about earlier in some of the different iPad apps. And there's to me desktop scoring applications until Dorico came out about 4 years ago had kind of stagnated, and now they're just starting to like push against one another, and there's competition there, and so they're getting better, some faster than others. But because the iPad is still comparatively new and it is as a platform relatively ubiquitous as a tablet, like there's not a lot of like those kinds of consumer level tablets that are with the same install base as iPads. And the cost of that software is, compared to a lot of other stuff, pretty low. There is a lot of competition there, and the developments in that space are happening pretty rapidly, and in a way that I think dramatically outpaces the rate of development in desktop scoring applications like Finale and Sibelius and Dorico and MuseScore. And those are moving, but just much more slowly because it's a bigger ship this year.
Is it more of a Tower of Babel scenario, or are they getting a little bit better where if you know how to use Microsoft Word, you're going to be able to figure out Google Docs? That's not a problem.
They are mostly, the best ones are still mostly working with PDF files. And so if you can move around PDF files and organize them in a library and write on them with a pencil, like that's basically everything you need to do. They do very different things than what Finale and Sibelius and Dorico and MuseScore do. They would not be a good thing to like replace one of those. They are designed specifically and have tools that are specific to reading and performing and rehearsing. And so they are, I think, very easy to use. I know people that are not super comfortable using a lot of technology who use these to great effect. I think one of the people that I know that uses this stuff the most is actually a collaborative pianist here at the university. She accompanies tons of voice students, and the voice students here, this is a little different at every school, but the voice students here are required to have an accompanist at every lesson. And so, she's just bouncing around from lesson to lesson to lesson all day. And she's got all of the music on her iPad, and she accompanies the vocal repertoire class. And so she just has to like sit down once a week, I think, and just accompany 10 different art songs, bang, 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 bang. And it's just 10 brand new things every time. It's like an audition pianist on Broadway or something. There's just new stuff, whatever people bring in, they just put it in a Dropbox folder, and she opens it, and we're good to go. And so like those kinds of workflows are adopting this technology pretty rapidly. And there are some orchestras and opera houses that are starting to adopt these as well. And for those kinds of things, we have a whole lot of people. I think those are the ways where this stuff is the most valuable, is when you either have a lot of repertoire that you need to go through very, very quickly, or a lot of people that all need to be on the same page, like in an opera. Those are the places that benefit the most from this kind of technology.
And go ahead, Sam. Sorry.
Or even at something that I do that's the same technology but a totally different purpose is if I get a jazz gig and it's going to be like a real book gig, we're just going to pick some tunes out of the real book. I don't have to take my big falling apart 5-pound bag of book that I bought in 1993. I've got both editions of the real book on my iPad, and I can search alphabetically, and I read them both through text recognition, so I can actually most of the time find the title of the piece. That is just massively different. And this might seem like a wild goose chase, but I was thinking that having an orchestra, for example, where everyone is using a tablet could open up different types of composition that harness the power of indeterminacy of the type that Boulez sort of invented. I guess not indeterminacy, but what did he call it? Not indeterminate, but he had his own
chance.
Aleatoric, yes. Aleatoric was the idea. It's like a choose your own adventure novel, right? Like you decide how you're going to trace your way through the piece. You could have a score that has movable parts, so the players know all the different sections, but something that happens dictates how the piece is going to lay out during this performance, and you could have different performances that are never the same. That would be a nightmare for a librarian. I would imagine.
Or not. If it's all laid out to begin with. The hardest part, I think, would be actually instructing the musicians on how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Compared to a single librarian. But, without getting too heavily geek-oriented about this, I just can't not ask this question, Dave, which everything that you're talking about, actually, I'm doing a lot of work right now in developing a CRM and ticketing platform. And one of the big shifts we made was to give up a SQL database structure and adopt a dynamic database structure. So it's in AWS. And what you're talking about is something that is uniquely suited to benefit from that same kind of environment, where from a cost structure is you can dump a metric shitload of content into AWS and there's zero storage cost ostensibly. You only pay when you retrieve something and actually need to use it. And you're only going to be using a fraction of a percentage of an overall large music library at one point in time. And so it's basically paying access from a licensing standpoint to that library, and then you pull up what you need when you need, and it will never also have to worry about being maxed out from being overused or have to slow down, all that kind of other good technological benefits that are associated with a dynamic database structure. But that opens up, I think, kind of another topic that I didn't think I wanted to talk to, but I think I do now, which is both of you have to start to now talk to students, especially if they are going to move into a professional or consider a professional career, of the reality between self-publication and the older traditional go out and find a music publisher direction. You both look like you have some thoughts on this.
Well, you have a new composition student. The first thing is they say, I want to write film music. And then after they finish their first 24-bar clarinet duet.
That's not what they say. That's false. As of about 6 years ago, they now say, I want to write video game music.
Video games.
I would say it's half and half. So they want to do one of those.
Whatever it is, they want it to be
entertainment
epic.
Industry.
And then they write their first clarinet duet that's 24 bars long, and then they say, hey, how do I get this published? As if getting published is this thing that is some sort of magical destination that once they get there, it's all milk and honey from there on out or something. I don't know exactly what they
for
think.
Those residuals to come in.
That's right.
Whatever that means.
So
yeah,
a fatherly version of this piece of advice, or in a not snarky, kind way, I point out what we all know about this, that it doesn't matter if that piece gets published or not right now. You're never going to make any money off of it. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, and the thing that they asked before is how do I copyright it, which is also not a valuable endeavor. But the world of music publishing is, for most composers, not super lucrative unless you are in a very specific set of niches. If you are writing a lot of pedagogical music, if you are writing for you could write beginning piano arrangements of things. You could be writing for beginning band or orchestra. You could be writing for school choirs or church choirs. And these are all things where the publishing industry is pretty turning over a lot of music all the time, because these school bands need new stuff all the time. Church choirs can't keep singing the same stuff all the time, or they don't want to. And so they actually do have sales figures that are like reasonable. But for the sorts of music that I write or the music that Sam write, the sale of or the rental of that score and the materials that go with it is not like going to redound to a lot. And the people that I know that are published a lot of times have 1 or 2 or 4 pieces that are published with 1 or 2 or 4 different publishers each. They don't have like a long-term ongoing relationship unless you are somebody who is relatively established, that has a reputation and is regularly getting commissions from major orchestras or major chamber ensembles. It's unlikely that you are going to have like this long-term quasi-permanent relationship with an individual publisher, the way someone might have 40 years ago. And the thing about our field is that there are a lot of people who are making a lot of music, and a lot of it is very, very, very good. And it doesn't hurt, or there's not a lot that you can do with the help of a publisher to stand out that you can't also do on your own. And I think this is something that I tell my students all the time, is that the things that a publisher can do for you, especially at the early stages of your career, are not significantly different or better, and in many cases they're worse than the things that you can do for yourself. So I can say that I personally self-published entirely. I don't pursue publication with established publishing companies, for better and worse. And I'm a big nerd. I'm happy to figure out how to set up an online store and customize it to my needs for the kinds of things that I sell. Not everybody is willing to do that, and there are different levels of control that you can get from different kinds of platforms, and kind of the least control and the most cost that you can get is an established publishing company. And there's a long road between that and like going to Kinko's and selling copies out of the back of your truck or something like that. Which is
If a student asks me about publishing, I will likely give them a speech about how much they could help themselves by becoming an effective networker, get good at memorizing names, and get good at delivering a killer elevator pitch, and make your scores look fantastic. Those things are going to help you a lot more than worrying about who your publisher is going to be.
And for most composers, in as much as there is money in music composition, it is not in sales or rentals, it is in commissions. And so the thing that Sam just said is that developing relationships with musicians who would be interested in commissioning you is a much more valuable use of your time, a much better investment in your future income, as cynical as that sounds, than getting 45 copies of your clarinet duet printed and sending them to 45 different publishers, which most publishers don't take unsolicited anything, much less printed materials. So the much more valuable investment is to develop your network of people who would want to perform your music. And in fact, just having your music performed, thanks to ASCAP and BMI and other PROs around the world, is comparatively more money than you would probably make from having the thing published by a major publisher anyway.
I think this
jargon alert, really quick. ASCAP, BMI. Let listeners know what that is.
Yes, sorry. ASCAP and BMI are performance rights organizations. They handle the, in a legal sense, performance, which includes playback in recordings of musical compositions. There are different performance rights organizations around the world. The two main ones that we have in the United States are ASCAP and BMI. They do basically, it's like Pepsi and Coke. They basically do the same thing for the same kinds of people. And so you can, as a composer or a music publisher, choose to affiliate with one or the other. And when your works are performed, the performing organization or the venue has to have a license, which they almost certainly do if it's a normal performing venue. And it's up to them to have that license, and then you can report that performance, or they can report that performance, and composers and publishers or if you're a self-published composer, both of those are you, then you get the money from that. And it's actually, I think, more than a lot of people would imagine. And it's certainly more, I think, than most people would make from a publisher selling copies of their scores. Like, you get, I don't know, 10 cents or a quarter for every sale of a piece. You get a lot more than that for a performance from BMI or ASCAP.
Yeah. To me, this dovetails into the idea of academia and a composer, because to me, if you're firmly ensconced in academia, as in you're a professor and you're a composer, then composing isn't about making money, probably is for a very select few. But composing is not about money, but you do get sort of career currency by getting performances and getting recordings and having your pieces associated with bigger and bigger name performers. And so that's wrapped up in your general career advancement as the composing professor. As compared to someone who's really trying to go out there and do it and, but drive a cab like Philip Glass and, try and get your music performed and try and make a living. So I don't know how much of that actually goes on these days.
Well, and it goes back to something that we talked about earlier, is students wanting to come in and they don't exactly know what they want to do. One of the things that I often try to impress on students is that there's no licensure system for being a composer. Like, you just go and do it. And when they come in and they say, I want to write for video games, I say, well, there's people here that make video games. Why aren't you writing? How do you know any of them? Have you talked to any of them? That's free. You don't need any experience doing it. And you can just do it. And that's how you get experience, is by doing it. And that's how you learn, is by doing it. And there's no, the same with having a relationship with a publisher. Like, that's a nice thing that you can say, and that is impressive to some kinds of people, especially people who are outside of our field, that it can be particularly impressive. But that's not to say that that's not important. Like, that is important, to be able to say something that is impressive about your background. But just doing the thing does not require that. Just writing music, just having music performed, just making money from the writing of the music and the performing of the music does not require even a music degree. I'm sometimes a bad recruiter when somebody comes and says, I want to get a master's degree in music composition. I say, you can just write music, and you don't actually need that degree. And I emphasize that I'm upfront. Like, this is not a fast track to the professoriate. Like, I was, not a gainfully employed full-time professor for a long, long time after I finished my doctorate. And, it is not guaranteed. And most of the people that I went to school with that have doctorates that are approximately identical to mine do not have full-time tenure track teaching jobs. I know a lot of doctors who are not doing their doctor thing as their main gig. And that does not mean that they have failed as musicians, but it does mean that they spent a lot of time and energy and money pursuing a degree. And if all you want to do is, write music, then you should just write music. And if you want to take lessons, you can pay me and I'll teach you 1 hour lessons every week. That's a heck of a lot cheaper than a master's degree. And so, I think that's an ethical. I honestly, his name's Roddy Miller, and I think he would support me in that. I think this is an ethical concern. Is that I want to make sure that students who come to study with me are doing it with their eyes open, and I still have people that come and study with me. It's not like I've scared them all off. And so I hope that means something to them when we have that conversation, similar to a conversation that I have when they're approaching graduation. I make sure that I tell them all, reflect on what you've learned here and take that with you. And it's really important that they understand that if in 10 years they are not, writing for a major motion picture in Los Angeles or being commissioned by the Cleveland Orchestra, that does not mean that they are a failure as a musician or as a composer or as a student or as an artist or anything. It just means that it's really hard, and that they can still be exactly as good a composer. And I tell them from day one, I'm a composer, you're a composer, Bach is a composer, we're all composers here. Now, let's move forward from there. That doesn't mean that they're a failure as a composer because they haven't, had their violin prelude performed by Hilary Hahn. That's just not what we're doing here. And there's a lot of paths for people to come in and out of composition programs.
Yeah, I'm confronted with the ethical dilemma far less than Dave is, because actually most of my students are in a field that's got a pretty good placement rate. You know, you get a band directing degree from us, you're probably going to get a job. I've got the numbers to prove it, you know. But I encourage them to keep composing. And what I tell them is, like, your principal is going to come to you and say, hey, I need an arrangement of, you know, Eye of the Tiger for brass quintet this Friday. Taking orchestration will help, but whatever you come up with of that thing will be better if you took 2 semesters of composition lessons in college. I guarantee it. I absolutely guarantee it. And to me, a lot of
at the very least, you'll be able to do it a lot faster.
Yeah. A lot of the enjoyment I get as a teacher has to do with what a fantastic professor that I studied with at Michigan State, Punya Mishra, who now teaches at Arizona State. Great guy. Sort of like high-level education thought is his field. And he said he was a big proponent of just the idea of leading a more aesthetically rich life. And we should devote resources in college to helping people and grade school to helping people do that. And I'm firmly in agreement with that. And if somebody taking a couple semesters of composition lessons does that, I'm happy.
Well, that brings up another, it would be great to have the time to jump down that rabbit hole, but basically the equivalency of an advanced degree in something like composition or music performance, which is really the same as just buying time until you get a job. And yeah, there are the ethical concerns that go into that. And as a matter of fact, I think that will be another topic that I'll probably just do at some point in time. I just got to find people to talk about it, honestly. But to kind of wrap things up here, I'm going to ask one question for each of you and limit it to really your intersection of composers in academia and how they intersect with the orchestra and opera world in particular. If there was one thing you could change right now about that relationship, what would it be?
Who? I didn't know you were going to grant me such all-encompassing power.
That's what a podcast is all about.
I don't know exactly what form this would take, but I would love to see more things that are like kind of professional, I guess they're sometimes called training orchestras, like the New World Symphony, things that are structured to help young musicians kind of get experience and transition into things that are more like a professional experience. Because I think those are really valuable for networking in a way that can be really challenging, especially if you are at relatively small institutions like Sam and I are at. It's really hard for composers to imagine what it is like to work with an orchestra or to work with an opera company. And there are kind of small lab ensembles. There are kind of opera scenes workshops that are along these lines. And I feel like that most composers coming out of music programs today do not have access to those because there are so few of those opportunities. There are some orchestras that do kind of mentoring and kind of reading session type things with young composers, and that can be really valuable. I know composers who have been a part of reading sessions with regional and even major orchestras around the country, and someone in that reading session heard the thing that they were doing, and it became the start of a relationship that led to, even if just like one commission for what we kind of sometimes snarkily refer to as an opener. You get the new music thing on the concert is the 8-minute opener that's very exciting and has 45 percussionists, and then you go to your real concert. But those kinds of things are really valuable because they start to develop relationships, and those can start with small, low stakes, though costly for the orchestra, training systems like something, I don't know what it would look like to be the New World Symphony, but with young composers involved. But I think something like that would be really exciting.
Sam?
That one's tough. That's kind of like most of what I was thinking. Obviously, this answer is going to have to do with money and priorities, right? And you want to tweak those in a way. I think one thing that would be very interesting, since Dave kind of covered the ground I was thinking of is for those worlds to more openly embrace, this is going to seem off the wall, but more openly embrace sound reinforcement and amplification and signal processing. Make the idea of those being present in that kind of a performance not seem super outlandish or crazy.
All right, this is Jeffrey, the jargon giraffe.
Yeah.
Whenever you see Jeffrey pop up, that means explain those things for the listener. Sound reinforcement.
Well, basically amplification, which many orchestras use. If you saw a guitar concerto with an orchestra, there's a very solid chance that it was amplified, but the goal of that amplification is to make it sound as much like a normal guitar as possible. It's hard for me to not think of this as something that's important that academia needs how to figure out how to embrace, considering for most of the 19-year-olds I talk to, if they had expressed any musical agency where they go out and do something on their own and really do it of their own volition, there's a solid chance it involved a microphone and a PA system and a guitar and some turntables or whatever. And
a laptop.
And academia struggles very, very, very hard to embrace any of that stuff.
Really?
Yes. And so if orchestras were performing pieces where you're not just trying to make the natural sound of the orchestra sound louder, you're trying to make the orchestra sound like it's amplified and therefore it sounds different. I mean, this is an outgrowth of the idea because I have a contemporary ensemble, which this semester is the first semester we have a PRO ensemble, a proper PRO plus 2 percussionists. Haven't had that before. And so our philosophy has been amplification is orchestration, right? A viola doesn't really do that job very well, but if she puts the F hole right on the microphone and does it, it will work. And for contemporary ensemble like us, I don't see any other way to go forward, considering the limited amount of music we have. So embrace the amplifier. That's mine.
Interesting. That's a pretty radical idea. I know. That's to that. Both of those answers were great because I wasn't expecting either of those, which means that they're going to be fabulous in their very nature because they make you think and they're contemplative. And I think that's exactly the kind of direction that all of this needs to go. We're talking about academia. It's all about contemplation. And I think it's also a really good place to kind of end things because hopefully that's going to give people something to really think about and go back through and listen to this again. And if nothing else, you have to listen to it again just to catch all the jargon, so we actually get it. So to that end, I think we're just going to kind of wrap it up right here. So let me thank both of our guests here, Sam and David. Thank you guys very much for taking your time out on a Sunday afternoon to come in and chat with everybody. And I hope everyone was able to walk away and get something out of it.
My pleasure. It was great.
Take care, everybody.
Awesome.